When it comes to sewing garments, darts are something that are used often. If you are sewing darts on a lightweight fabric, I have a couple tips for making them look a little bit more professional. So this is what a dart on a very lightweight fabric, maybe something that's going to be used for the bodice of a dress or maybe even on a shirt, and this is what you want it to look like. You don't want to have any extra bulk at the top of your dart, and you want it to be nice and smooth. You also don't want to see your marks from when you had to mark your dart from your pattern. So the first tip I'm going to share with you is to use pins to mark your darts. So if you have your piece of fabric and maybe you have your pattern piece that you're marking from, or you're following a pattern and it tells you the dimensions or areas where you need to make your marks for your dart, rather than using a removable marking pen or pencil, whether that's a wash away or one that is heat soluble or air soluble, you want to use pins. So if our dart, say on the bottom, needs to be 2 inches apart, I'm going to make those marks using a pin. I'm going to place a pin on one mark. I'm going to place a pin on the other mark. If our dart then needs to be 5 inches tall, I can obviously see through my fabric, so I can use the marks on my cutting mat, or you can bring in a ruler and measure up your 5 inches, and you will place another pin mark there. Now you want to use your pins to fold your fabric to create your dart. So this is the wrong side of my fabric. I have the right side down. So I'm just going to pivot it, and I'm going to fold my fabric matching my pin marks. So these 2 pin marks down at the bottom, they need to line up perfectly, right like so. I can go ahead and remove one, reposition the other to hold both layers together. And then our top pin, marking the top of our dart, needs to be right along that folded edge. So if you need to lay it down and then use your finger to reposition it so it's along the edge, do that. You can then use an additional pin to hold those 2 layers together, and you're going to place it right at where that pin is coming out. That way when you remove this one, you still have this marker as to where your dart needs to end. Now when you're stitching your darts, especially on lightweight fabric, you don't want to do any back stitching. So this lower edge, especially if this is going to be the bodice of a dress, is going to get caught into the neck seam allowance of when you attach the bodice to the lower skirt part of the dress. And up here, you don't want to do any back stitching either, but you need a way to secure it. So we're going to do that by tying it, hand tying it, rather than doing back stitching, which means we need to end our stitching here. So we're going to start stitching at this end and end here. Now if you're making a fairly long dart, it may be hard to eyeball the line you need to go along your dart and make sure that you're stitching it straight. If it's a fairly short dart, say we're going like 2.5 inches, it would be easier to eyeball that line. This is a much longer line. Again, we want to avoid using marking pens or pencils because it may not come out, it may become permanent, and you don't want to ruin it. So we're again going to use pins to mark our line. So again, I can see through my fabric, so I'm using the lines on my cutting mat. You may need to pull in a ruler, but I can see my line that goes straight from this pin down to this pin here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place pins along what is going to become my stitching line, and I want to make sure that I am placing them in a direction that allows me to remove them as I stitch up close to them. So since I'm starting at this end here, you can see I'm placing my pins so that as I stitch from here to about here, I can easily grab the head of that pin and pull it out. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and stitch it. Again, I'm starting at the end, so as soon as I lower my presser foot, I can grab that pin out of the way, right like so, so I don't stitch over it. And now I'm going to follow my pin mark guideline that I've provided myself. Again, I'm not back stitching. I'm going to stitch up to the end of this pin, and as I get close to it, I can remove it. Once this one's out of the way, I know I am stitching from where I stopped to my next pin. Right like so. Go ahead and remove it when I get there. And then same thing, from where I stopped to my last pin, which my last pin mark happens to be the end of my dart. So I'm stitching up to it. I want to slow down as I approach this end because I want to make sure that I don't accidentally stitch off too early. And again, I want to end my dart right at that pin. Now, we are at the end of our dart, and rather than doing back stitching, we want to hand tie those ends. If your machine has an automatic automatic thread cutter option, don't use it at this point because we want to have longer thread tails so we can actually tie those in a knot. So you're going to raise the presser foot, going to raise your needle and pull it off of the machine. Give yourself a generous amount of thread to be able to tie your knot and then clip it using a pair of scissors. Once you have your two ends, you can simply tie this into a knot. In order to do that, you're going to take your needle and your bobbin thread, just wrap them together like so to create one knot. And I'm going to tie at least 2, most likely 3 knots. Do one more, and I'm pulling it fairly tight. I want to make sure this is nice and secure. And now I'm going to clip these threads very, very close to that knot that I just tied. Once you've clipped your threads, if you're worried that your knot's going to come undone, you can use a fray check or something like that to extra secure that knot. But if you do at least 2 or 3, it should not come undone. You can then give this a press, and then you're going to have a nice professional looking dart. You have no extra bulk of a knot of back stitching up here at the top. You haven't back stitched at the bottom, but of course this is going to get caught in the seam allowance when you attach that into a garment. And you don't have any marking lines that you need to worry about trying to remove because we've done all of our markings using pins. So use pins and tie knots for professional darts.